December 15, 1967, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. A little before 5 in the evening, a line of cars rolls onto the Silver Bridge, reaches the brake lights ahead, and stops. The whole span is full. It is the last hour of the workday, 3 shopping days before Christmas, and the traffic across the Ohio River has slowed to a crawl of bumpers and exhaust and idling engines. The bridge under those cars is 39 years old. It was built in 1928 and painted a bright aluminum color that gave it its name. It carries U.S. Route 35 from Point Pleasant on the West Virginia side, across the river to Gallipolis, Ohio. For most of its life, it has done this without anyone thinking much about it. People cross it to work, to shop, to visit family on the other bank. On this evening, the 2 lanes are packed in both directions, and the load on the old steel is heavier than any load it was built to hold. At about 4:58, without a sound anyone would later agree on, the bridge is gone. Not part of it, all of it. The main span drops into the river in seconds, and the cars go with it, and the people in the cars go with them. 31 vehicles fall into the cold December water. 46 people die. There is no warning. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that made this disaster different from almost any other. No creak, no crack that anyone had time to react to, no minutes to get off the bridge. One moment, there is a bridge with rush hour traffic on it. The next moment, there is a river with the traffic in it. The question that would occupy engineers for the next 2 years was simple to ask and terrible to answer. How does an entire bridge fall down at once, with no notice, on an ordinary Friday? The answer was hidden inside a single piece of steel, in a crack so small you could not have seen it if you were standing on the exact spot where it lived. To understand how that crack brought down a bridge, you have to understand how the bridge was holding itself up. Most suspension bridges you picture have cables, thick woven ropes of steel wire draped between towers from which the roadway hangs. The Silver Bridge did not use cables. It used chains, long flat bars of steel called eyebars, each one shaped a little like a stretched loop with a hole at each end. The bars were linked together, pinned through hole, into 2 great chains that ran the length of the bridge. Those chains held the roadway up. It was an older design even in 1928, elegant and cheaper than cable, and it had one feature that would matter more than anything else about it. The chain was what engineers call non-redundant. Each link in it carried a share of the load, and there was no backup for any single link. In a cable of many wires, one wire can snap and the others take the strain. In this chain, at the critical joints, a single eye-bar carried the load with only one partner beside it. If one bar failed, its partner could not hold the weight alone, and if that joint let go, the tension that had been running through the whole chain had nowhere left to go. Remember that word. Non-redundant. It is going to come back. There is a reason the builders chose that design in the first place, and it is worth understanding, because it was not carelessness. In the 1920s, the eye-bar chain was a known and respected way to build a suspension bridge. It used less material than a cable of woven wire. It could be fabricated in a shop, shipped as finished bars, and pinned together on site without the slow work of spinning thousands of individual wires in the air. For a river crossing at a small town, on a budget, it was a sensible answer. The men who chose it were working with the best knowledge of their time, and by that knowledge, the bridge was sound. What they did not have was a full understanding of how steel behaves over decades under tension, in weather, at a joint they would never be able to see inside again. That understanding would come later, and much of it would come from this bridge. The joints themselves are where the whole design lived or died. At each link, a heavy steel pin passed through the eye of one bar and the eye of the next, holding the chain together the way the links of a watch band hold to one another. The pin took the load and passed it from one bar to the next, all the way along the span. It was a clean idea. It was also an idea with a small number of critical points, and at each of those points, the safety of the entire bridge came down to the soundness of the steel around a single hole. The bridge was designed in the 1920s for the traffic of the 1920s. The cars of that era were light. A typical automobile weighed perhaps 1.5 tons, and there were fewer of them, and they did not sit bumper to bumper across the river at rush hour because there were not yet enough of them to do that. The engineers who built the Silver Bridge built it with a margin, the way engineers do. They assumed a certain weight, and they made the steel strong enough to carry more than that, and by the standards of 1928, the bridge was sound. 40 years is a long time in the life of an automobile. By 1967, the cars were bigger, heavier, more numerous. A loaded truck of the late 1960s weighed several times what the traffic of 1928 had weighed. The bridge that had been designed for a light and thin stream of model-era cars was now holding a dense, heavy, modern jam of steel. The margin the builders left was being eaten away, not all at once, but year after year, load after load. The bridge did not know it was living in a different century, it only knew the weight. And there was something else in the steel, something that had been there from the very beginning, waiting. To follow it, go back to the day one particular eyebar was made. Somewhere in the process of casting and finishing that bar, a tiny flaw formed in the metal, a microscopic crack on the inside of the hole where the pin would pass through. It was smaller than 1/10 of an inch. You could not see it. The men who made the bar could not see it, and the men who assembled the bridge could not see it, and no inspection of that era could have found it, because it was inside the steel, at a joint, under a pin, 60 feet in the air. For 39 years, that crack did almost nothing. It sat in the metal while the bridge was painted and repainted, while the cars below it changed from Model A Fords to Chevrolets with fins, while 2 generations of people crossed over it and never gave the steel a thought. A crack that small, in a bridge that was mostly just standing there, is not an emergency. It is a seed. What made the seed grow was a combination the engineers of 1928 did not fully understand. The joint was under constant tension, pulling the steel apart at the microscopic level, day and night, for 4 decades. And the steel, exposed to the weather, to rain, and to the chemistry of the air over an industrial river, was slowly corroding at that hidden point, stress pulling, corrosion eating. The two together do something worse than either alone. Engineers call it stress corrosion cracking, and it means a flaw that would have sat quiet under stress alone, or corroded slowly with no stress, instead grows. Slowly, silently, a little larger each year. And the load on the joint was never truly still. Every car that rolled across the bridge flexed the chain a little, worked the pin and the eye against each other, and let them settle back when it passed. Over 39 years that came to many millions of small tugs, each one nothing on its own, all of them together working the flaw the way a wire is worked when you bend it back and forth until it snaps. Engineers call that fatigue, the slow growth of a crack under a load that keeps coming and going. Fatigue widening the flaw, corrosion eating at it, tension holding it open, all of them at the same hidden point, at the same time. No single one of them would have brought the bridge down in the span of a human life. Together they were a clock. There was one more thing about the metal itself, and it belongs in the story, because it is the reason the flaw was fatal rather than merely serious. The eyebars were made of a high-strength steel, heat-treated to carry a great deal of load in not much metal. Strength of that kind usually comes at a price, and the price is toughness. Toughness, to an engineer, is not the same thing as strength. It is the ability of a metal to tolerate a crack without letting that crack run. A tough, ductile steel meets a small flaw by yielding around it, stretching and bending and giving warning before it lets go. The steel in the Silver Bridge chain did not do that well. It was strong, and it was hard, and it had little toughness to spare, which meant a crack in it did not have to grow far before it reached the point of no return. In a more forgiving metal, the same flaw might have opened slowly into a visible sag, a bent bar, something a person could see. In this metal, it stayed small and quiet and then went straight from holding to broken with almost nothing in between. The bridge was built strong. It was not built tough. That distinction, barely understood in 1928, is one of the hardest lessons the wreckage would teach. By December of 1967, the crack that had started smaller than 1/10 of an inch had grown across enough of the eyebar that the remaining metal was carrying far more than it was meant to. The bar was still holding. On any given day, it was still holding, but it was closer to the edge than anyone alive knew, and the margin was almost gone. Now put the pieces on the bridge together. A non-redundant chain, where one failed link cannot be caught by its neighbors. A load heavier than the bridge was ever designed to carry, sitting on it bumper to bumper in the Christmas rush. A steel strong enough to hold that weight, but too brittle to warn anyone before it let go. And inside one eyebar, at one joint, a crack that had spent 39 years growing to exactly the length it needed to fail. On the evening of December 15th, the bar reached its edge. The crack ran the rest of the way through in an instant. The eyebar broke. What happened next happened faster than description can keep up with. The joint that bar was part of came apart. Its partner could not hold the load alone, and so that joint failed too. The tension that had been running the length of the chain, held in balance for 40 years, was suddenly unbalanced, and it tore through the structure looking for something to pull against. There was nothing. One tower on the West Virginia side, no longer held in balance by the chain, was pulled over. The span, no longer suspended from anything, dropped. The whole thing came down in seconds. Not link by link over a long minute, the way a person might imagine a bridge failing. All at once, the way a chain fails when you cut one link and the load is already at the limit. The engineers who studied it later described it as the entire structure unzipping. One point let go, and the failure raced outward from that point through everything that had been depending on it. This is the property of a non-redundant structure that makes it so dangerous, and it is the reason the word matters. In a bridge with a margin, a failure is a warning. A single member cracks or bends or gives. The structure sags. Someone notices. The bridge is closed, and there is time. The failure announces itself before it becomes a catastrophe. In the chain of the Silver Bridge, there was no such courtesy. The first failure was also the last. The instant the load found a link that could no longer hold it, there was no second link to catch the weight, and no sag to warn a driver, and no time for anyone to do anything at all. The gap between fully standing and fully fallen was not a minute or even a handful of seconds of noticing. It was the time it takes a crack to finish running through a bar. Down below, the drivers had no part in any of this and no chance against it. The people stopped in traffic, felt the roadway give way beneath them, and fell with it into the river. It was December. The water was near freezing. The cars went in, and the current took them, and the winter darkness was coming down over the valley. On both banks, people who had been standing near the approaches or waiting to drive on, watched the bridge that had been there a moment before simply not be there. Some people came out of the water alive, boats put out from both banks in the last of the light, and men who had watched the collapse went in after the cars, and a number of people were pulled from the river and lived. A few had been near the very ends of the span, on the parts that did not fall the whole way, and they climbed clear. But most of those who went into the river did not come back up out of it, and within the hour, the effort along the bank had turned from rescue into recovery. That recovery took weeks. The Ohio River in December is cold enough to kill a person in minutes, and dark enough down deep that a diver cannot see his own hands, and the current kept shifting the wreckage along the bottom. Divers went down into that water again and again to find the cars and the people still in them. Cranes lifted twisted vehicles up onto barges. Piece by piece, through the coldest part of the winter, the bridge and the traffic it had been carrying were brought back up out of the river. 2 of the 46 were never found. Point Pleasant was a town of a few thousand people. In a place that size, 46 deaths are not a statistic. They are neighbors, and names everyone in town already knew, and empty chairs at Christmas dinner 3 days later. The whole town had used that bridge its whole life, crossing it without a thought 12 times a week. Now it was gone, and so were the people who had been on it. The bare facts are enough, and the facts deserve to be stated plainly and then left alone. 46 people got in their cars on a Friday afternoon, 3 days before Christmas, and they did not get home. Out of that came an investigation, and out of the investigation came the answer, and the answer changed the way an entire country looks at its bridges. The investigation fell to a body that was itself brand new. The National Transportation Safety Board had existed for only months when the Silver Bridge came down, created to look independently into disasters of exactly this kind and to answer to no agency whose reputation might depend on the answer. This was one of its first great tests. Alongside federal highway engineers and metallurgists, the board set out to do something that had rarely been attempted on this scale, to reconstruct a fallen bridge on dry land and read, from the broken steel, the exact sequence in which it had come apart. Federal investigators pulled the wreckage from the river and laid it out and studied it piece by piece for 2 years. This was painstaking work. A bridge that has fallen into a river and been torn apart does not offer up its secret easily. The investigators had to reconstruct not just what broke, but the order in which it broke, because in a failure that fast, the order is everything. The last thing to break tells you nothing. The first thing to break tells you why. They found it. One eyebar at one joint on the Ohio side of the chain with a fracture that did not match the others. The other steel had failed the way steel fails when it is overloaded suddenly, torn apart in the moment of collapse. This one bar had a region on its broken face that was different. A part of the fracture was old. It had been there, growing, long before the bridge came down. That old region was the crack, and the crack was the beginning, and everything else had followed from it. The bar they were looking for turned out to be high up, in the chain near the top of a tower, at a joint where the eye of the bar wrapped around its pin. The crack had begun on the inside of that eye, at the very surface of the hole, pressed against the pin and hidden behind it. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Even if an inspector in 1967 had climbed to that joint and had somehow known to worry about that exact bar, the flaw was on a surface the pin itself covered. You could not have seen it without pulling the joint apart, and pulling the joint apart on a loaded bridge was the one thing no one could do. The crack lived in the single place on the whole structure where it was both most dangerous and least visible. To find the first break among all the others is not a small thing. When a bridge collapses, nearly every piece of it breaks somewhere, and most of those breaks happen in the same second, torn apart as the structure falls and hits the water and the bank. An investigator looking at that wreckage sees hundreds of broken faces of steel, and almost all of them are telling the same useless story, which is that they broke when everything broke. The work was to find the one face that told a different story, the one that had been broken, in part, before the fall. That is the difference between a fracture made in an instant and a fracture that grew over years, and it is written into the surface of the metal itself, if you know how to read it, and you are patient enough to look at every piece. Under the microscope, the story of 39 years was written in the metal, the tiny original flaw, the slow growth outward, year by year, driven by stress and corrosion and fatigue working together, and then, at the end, the final fast break where the remaining steel gave way in an instant. The bar told its own history to anyone who knew how to read a fracture, and what it said was that the bridge had been carrying a fatal crack for its entire life, and that nothing done in 1967 could have saved it once the crack reached its length, because by the time anything showed, the bridge was already falling. That was the hardest part of the finding to accept. There had been no warning because there could be no warning. The crack was invisible from the outside. The joint where it lived could not be seen without taking the bridge apart. The inspection methods of the day, a man with his eyes and a hammer looking at painted steel from a distance, had no way to find a flaw hidden inside the metal at a pinned joint 60 feet in the air. The bridge passed the inspections it was given because the inspections could not ask the question that mattered. And so the finding pointed a hard finger not just at one bridge, but at the way the whole country was watching its bridges, which for the most part was not watching them at all. Before December of 1967, there was no national standard for how often a bridge had to be inspected, or how, or by whom, or what should be written down. Bridges were built, opened, and mostly trusted to keep standing. Some states inspected, many did not, or did so only when something looked wrong. There was no requirement that anyone go and look, on a schedule, at the tens of thousands of bridges the country depended on every day. The Silver Bridge had been standing so long and so quietly that it had become part of the landscape, and things that are part of the landscape are the easiest things in the world to stop seeing. The collapse ended that. The disaster reached the president and the Congress, and out of it, over the next few years, came the first national bridge inspection standards. For the first time, the country required that its bridges be inspected regularly, on a set schedule, by people trained to do it, with the findings recorded and kept. The rule that came out of it governs the country to this day. Every public bridge of any size in the United States must be inspected at least once every 2 years, by qualified inspectors, to a single national standard, with the results recorded in a federal inventory that tracks the condition of every span from one inspection to the next. Bridges in worse shape are looked at more often than that. The 2-year cycle is not a suggestion. It is the floor. It is the reason that somewhere in the country, on almost any working day, an inspector is standing under a bridge and writing down what the steel is doing, so that the next hidden flaw is found in a notebook and not in a river. The idea that a bridge could simply be trusted to stand decade after decade with no one required to go and look was over. There was a second bridge to think about too. The Silver Bridge had a near-twin downriver at St. Mary's, West Virginia, built to a similar eyebar design in the same era. After the collapse, that bridge came under hard new scrutiny, and it was eventually closed and taken down rather than trusted to keep standing. The lesson had been learned in the worst possible way, and no one wanted to learn it twice on the same river. The standards also forced engineers to reckon with that word from the beginning of this story. Non-redundant. The Silver Bridge had fallen because a single failed link had no backup. In the years that followed, that kind of structure, where one hidden failure can take down the whole, was marked for special scrutiny and given a name, the fracture critical member, a piece whose failure means the failure of everything above it. If a design has no second chance built into it, then the inspection has to be the second chance. Engineers began to hunt specifically for the kind of flaw that had hidden in that eyebar, and to design new bridges so that no single piece carried the whole weight alone. Point Pleasant did not get its bridge back in the same place. A new bridge was built downriver and opened a little over a year later, carrying the same highway across the same water to Ohio. The town went on. But the collapse left a mark that went beyond the missing span. In local memory, the disaster also gathered a piece of folklore around it. A winged figure some said they had seen near town in the year before the fall. A legend that belongs to Point Pleasant and draws visitors to this day. It is a story, and it is not why the bridge came down. The reason the bridge fell was in the steel, and it had been there since 1928, and it is the part worth holding on to, because it is the part that keeps mattering. The cause of this disaster was not dramatic. It was not a storm, or a collision, or an act of anyone's will. It was a flaw the size of a scratch in a place no one could see, in a bridge that looked exactly as sound on its last morning as it had on its first. The danger was real for 39 years and visible for none of them. The bridge was not fine and then broken. It was breaking the entire time, so slowly that the breaking looked like standing still. Every bridge inspection that happens in the United States today, on a schedule, by a trained inspector, with a report that gets filed and kept, traces back in part to the 46 people who went into the Ohio River on the 15th of December, 1967. The rules that govern the steel over every river you cross were written in the wreckage of one bridge that fell because no one knew to look inside a single bar. The men who cast that bar in 1928 could not see what they had made. The men who inspected it for 4 decades could not see it either. It was smaller than 1/10 of an inch, and it was inside the metal, and it did its slow work in the dark where no eye could follow. The crack that took down the Silver Bridge had waited 39 years. Invoke.